All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you're ready for the next speaker, Shannon Wilkinson, CEO and founder of Tego Cyber, and also a dear friend of mine. Welcome, Shannon. How are you?
I'm great, Mel. How are you doing?
Doing fantastic. So happy to have you here today. To have the Tego team being, be one of our sponsors. So thank you for that. I want to, be just tell you I've been really excited about the threat intelligence piece. So I'll leave it up to you and take it away.
Okay, fantastic. So I really had a lot of fun preparing this presentation about identifying and detecting threats within your APIs. So let's start off a little bit about myself. I am the CEO and co-founder of Tego Cyber Inc. We are an autonomous threat correlation and threat hunting platform. Actually started off my career as a software developer for the United Nations, moved into developing platforms as well as managing software development teams. This is my second rodeo in the cybersecurity startup area. I also am a huge proponent of encouraging the next generation of women and girls in technology. So I authored a book about encouraging the next generation. So that's just a little bit about me, but who cares about that? Let's get into threat detection in APIs. You know, one of the things about APIs is that it's just made everything so connected, and it's made it essentially easier for attackers to attack organizations through APIs just because you're able to get access to data, maybe you're able to get access to endpoints. But probably one of my favorite, if I can call it favorite, attack vectors of APIs is actually how attackers have used APIs to automate and go through credential stuffing attacks so quickly. So basically stealing a list or a database of compromised credentials, plugging it into an API, and just going out there and hitting a website and just automating the ability to log into accounts that maybe aren't protected by MFA or 2FA, and just going through and compromising accounts like crazy. So we saw that way back when, about 3 years ago, with the Ring doorbell system of attackers getting access to accounts that weren't protected by multi-factor authentication. But there's a variety of different ways that attackers are using APIs to attack organizations. Of course, you also have DDoS attacks, just hitting an organization with so much traffic through their APIs that the APIs become unresponsive. Perhaps the business functions cease to stop functioning. As well as, of course, stealing data from organizations. So those are just kind of the typical attack vectors or the attack types that we see through APIs against organizations. I'm sure you've heard a lot about OWASP and the top 10 for APIs during this presentation, but I just kind of wanted to take a moment to actually compare the last from 2019 to the release candidate for 2023. And one of the things that I found kind of interesting is that there is a lot of commonality between the 2019 list and 2013. But there are also a couple new items on the list for the 2023 release candidate. One of them being a lack of protection from the automated threats. So like I was talking, those credential stuffing attacks, the bots, oh my God, the bots that are attacking organizations and going through. I mean, did you try to buy a PlayStation from Walmart or Target when it was very popular? It was almost impossible if you're a real human to get through the systems just because the bots hitting those websites and buying up all the PlayStations or the Microsoft consoles during that time. So we also see new things like the unsafe consumption of APIs, which is kind of interesting. But it's the same old things like broken level authorization or security misconfigurations that continue to plague those using APIs in organizations. So, it's going to be interesting to see going forward. I think, like Jeremy said, the future of API security and perhaps some of the standards that we might see coming out for API security. But where do API threats come from? Okay, we understand the vulnerabilities, the OWASP list and stuff like that, but where else can they come from? So, of course, being a software developer, it comes from bad coding. Like QA, we don't need any stinking QA. We didn't need to document our stuff. We don't need to worry about security. We're just developing stuff, right? There's also poor validation. Our organizations validating their SSL certs to protect the traffic and data, as well as poor authentication. Some organizations don't even require authentication for the APIs. They're just like, we need an API for this business function. We created an endpoint. We're calling the data. We're getting access to the data that we need, and yeah, we're ready to go. There's also, of course, the automated threats. So like I said, the bots that are making it impossible sometimes for humans to interact with APIs and do things like purchasing popular items at Christmas or when they're released. And then the other API threat that is very common is, utilization of APIs. Knowing how much data should be going out from an API and kind of establishing a baseline and knowing what's normal. And I think one of the first steps, I think Jeremy covered this a bit in the last presentation, but one of the first steps that you have to go through is actually knowing where are your APIs? How do you protect what you don't know about? So you need either internally within your organization or externally, somebody who's familiar with APIs, API documentation, to go through and perform a thorough analysis of what APIs you have in your environment, as well as not only what APIs do you have, but where are they sitting? Are they public or private within your organization? What kind of data are they touching? Is there authentication? Really kind of a thorough mapping of your APIs and what they're doing so that you know how to protect them. And it's also not a one and done process. It's not, yay, I documented my APIs in 2023 and I'm all done. I'm going to, dust my hands off and be done with it. But rather, it's a continuous process. You have to continue looking for APIs and documenting your APIs and knowing what your APIs are doing in your environment going forward, because I'm sure your development isn't going to stop and your use of APIs is not going to stop in the near future. So you need to continue going through that process as long as you continue developing and continue using APIs in your environment. After you go through documenting your APIs and knowing what's out there, you need to also establish what is normal. A clown in the sewer, probably not normal. Well, you also need to know with your APIs, what is the normal flow of data? How much data should I expect to be going out via my API? I also need to know what's my standard user behavior with the APIs, kind of the who, what, when, where, how of the APIs. Are my customers primarily and my calls primarily going to be coming from the United States? Are people going to be calling in from all over the place? How are they going to authenticate? Another thing that we should try to establish is what's the expected level of errors that I should see from my API calls. It's never going to be 0% level of errors within the APIs. Somewhere between 1 and 5% is probably what could be considered normal for calls against your API. And hopefully you are logging those calls so you can have the monitoring so that you know if something is abnormal. But then also, just like know your customer, you should also know your APIs. Like I said a little bit earlier, know what kind of data is exposed or accessible through the APIs. Are the endpoints secured? Are you authenticating properly? Are you protecting it properly with SSL certs without using HTTP redirects? What is normal and what are your APIs doing in the course of normal functions? After you establish what is normal, now you can know what's not normal and detect the anomalies. So perhaps one of the easiest ways to detect anomalies with APIs is detecting unusual traffic. So a sudden spike or increase in the traffic, unexpected API calls, Also, those error messages, possible scanning of vulnerabilities, throwing a lot of 404 or 500 errors all of a sudden, which is outside the scope of what it would be normal, that perhaps 1 to 5% of API calls that would fail. You can also have anomaly detection on unusual user behavior, something that I call extraordinary traveler, where perhaps you have a customer that always authenticates from the United States. Well, now all of a sudden you have the customer authenticating from the United States and in Africa and Asia and the Russian Federation. Well, all within a 24-hour period. That's not normally possible. So you would have to know that is not usual behavior for the customer, and that is something that should raise a red flag, as well as repeated failed attempts to authenticate for users because of improper keys, or perhaps somebody is just trying to brute force your APIs with different authentication keys. You need to be able to have detection and monitoring on that, so you know when something anomalous is happening. You can also create a list of API specific rules, just like you would have a list of rules for horror movies, like don't ever go in the basement by yourself. You should set up some rules specifically for your APIs, like excessive API calls, rate limits. You do, like the meme says, you do rate limit, right? Right? So you got to set rate limits for your APIs. You can't just say it's an all you can eat buffet and come on and get it. You also have to have those API specific rules for unusual user or data behavior. One easy way to know if somebody is trying to insert data or access data is to validate the schema of what is being inserted or what is being called. And then also with the unusual user behavior, one of the things that I love the bot story with APIs, but one of the things with the new release candidate for OWASP was talking about unusual user behavior and being able to detect improper usage of your APIs by looking at, perhaps if you're an e-commerce organization, looking at the time it would take a customer normally to add something to the cart and then go through the checkout process. And what we find with bots is sometimes the developer of these bots are not very smart. So they do add to cart and buy in less than 1 second. Well, that's not normal user behavior. So you add, you could set up some logic where you say, well, it takes a normal user 5 seconds to add to the cart and buy it. So anything below that is something that we need to alert on and go investigate. You also can set up API specific rules to check for configuration changes. So changes to your schema or changes to potentially changes to your APIs. And that is not normal. And that is something that should also raise a red flag. As well as you should be scanning and looking for suspicious payloads, particularly if you're using APIs for file transfers. So you should be scanning for the deposit of files via API, scan it before it goes into your data warehouse and repository, as well as, I would say, regularly scan those files as well when they are sitting in your data warehouse, to make sure that nothing malicious is found in those files that are being transferred via your APIs. So when we look at API security, I like to apply the same thought process that now goes into cloud security, and that is of the shared responsibility model. So who is responsible for API security? Well, of course, it starts with the software developers. Software developers, one, doing code reviews and also doing reviews of the code repository. Is it public? Is it private? What information is contained in it? Am I storing my API keys in a public repository on GitHub? As well as having code vulnerability scanning. So perhaps before something is put into production or something is a release candidate, scanning the code for vulnerabilities as well as vulnerable APIs. And then also documenting API endpoints. As a former software developer, I know one of the things that developers hate the most is documentation of their software and what they're developing, but it is essential as code becomes more complex, as we're relying on, code libraries, API endpoints. We need to start documenting that, and we need to get better at documentation. There's also the SBOM, or the software bill of materials. Knowing what APIs are in use so that we know, are there any unmanaged APIs out there? Are there vulnerable APIs out there? Anybody remember Log4j? The effect that those APIs can have on other organizations that are using those APIs. It's not just that one organization, but it can have a widespreading effect. So knowing what's in use and what other organizations' APIs that you're using is essential. And also knowing a bit, those third-party APIs that we're using, what do they have access to? If they're accessing data in our environment, do they have access to more than they should? Can we restrict the access to only what they need to do their function? Of course, also the developers, like I said, they need to go through and they need to make sure that they're protecting the credentials as well as authentication keys, not storing those keys out in public GitHub repositories. And then also, I think a consideration for developers would also be, do I need to make my APIs public, or can they remain private and, behind a DMZ or something like that in my organization? Is there really a need for this to be publicly facing, or, would it function just fine and normally if it was private to the organization and used for internal purposes? So that is just some of the ways that developers can take responsibility for API security. But it doesn't stop there. It is a shared responsibility with the rest of the organization. So Mel touched on this about audit and compliance, as well as, perhaps it's combined with the overall security team. But, there can be the policies and procedures of, if you want to use an API, what's the process of going through perhaps an authorization process of using a third-party API within your organization. There's the assessments, the scanning, and knowing what APIs are out there in your organization, what are they touching with. Attack surface management tools. I think we just had a great presentation on one of those tools just a minute ago. But, like I said, know your APIs, know what's out there, know what you need to protect, and as well as, what potential vulnerabilities there are. Things as simple as having AV or EDR on the endpoints and servers that are being used by these APIs, and then also having those web application firewalls out there to protect the APIs and the code and the servers and everything that the business is using, perhaps for those critical business functions. There's also a shared responsibility with the Security Operations Center, or the SOC, of the ingestion of API security logs. So those logs about the failed logins or the extraordinary travelers and those type of activities should be going into some sort of central repository where somebody would be taking action and saying, hey, there's a red flag over here. Our organization needs to take a look at it. It's possible that our APIs are under attack. There's also, the monitoring of the API activity through that central repository. Perhaps that's a SIM or a data lake. And also you can correlate threat intelligence like Tego does with our organization to alert on that information and bring in that threat intelligence into those platforms so that you know if something anomalous is going on. So with the monitoring within the SIM platform, your security operations team can basically say, nope, not on my watch. That's not going to happen. And OWASP actually identified insufficient logging and monitoring of API activity as one of the top 10 API threats in 2019. OWASP found typically with vulnerabilities of APIs or exploitation of APIs, it took more than 200 days for organizations to detect that their API was under attack. And perhaps even worse is that often the detection was done by a third party. So somebody would come in and say, hey, organization, your data is leaking, or an attacker would say, hey, I stole all your data through your API, which is extremely embarrassing. One, that an organization didn't detect it for almost a year, and two, somebody else told the organization that there was a problem with their API. So that's why the monitoring, the logging of APIs and what they are doing is so essential in either the SIM or data lake platforms. It's also a comprehensive way to look at the entire organization, not just your APIs, but you have not only your API attack surface, but you perhaps have your web application firewalls, your endpoints, your EDR, your antivirus, as well as, perhaps authentication logs going into the central repository so that you can go in there with threat intelligence, with API specific rules, and with correlation tools to actually identify the threats against your APIs and your organization. So the SIM or data lake platforms are in a holistic view of not just your APIs, but of the entire organization, so that you can kind of piece together the pieces of the puzzle to, like what Mel said just a little while ago, find patient zero. Where did the threat come in from, and where is it going from that first patient or that patient zero? So thank you very much. I have a lot of time left over. I didn't realize I would go through it so fast. But I hope you enjoyed the presentation and the information provided about how to identify and monitor for threats. So Mel, do you have any questions for me?
Hi, Shannon, for sure. Love the present. Oh, let me just get my mic a little bit closer to me now that I'm standing. Love the presentation. Loved all the movie. I love how you correlated movies into this. It was very entertaining. I loved it, especially the clown in the sewer. That was my favorite. But finding anomalies is tough, and I think
Mhm.
for me, a lot of the talks today regarding API security was very operationalized. How do we go from onboarding to implementing to operationalizing it? But the one thing I really wanted to ask you is what's the best approach once you have a solution in place, once you started monitoring these APIs? How do you go about threat modeling? What's the approach to design risk tolerance and secure systems by identifying what that API is? You mentioned something in your talk about understanding that API, right? And we
Mhm.
all know that we have the OWASP, but I really wanted to hear from you. How would you go about threat modeling and actually prioritizing those threats regarding APIs?
Yeah. So, like you said, we have to identify what the API is doing. You mentioned earlier, is it PCI, is it HIPAA, is it sensitive customer information? And then based on that, based on what kind of information perhaps is in that API or accessible through that API, if it's essential customer data or sensitive data, then the risk or the threat for that API is very high. And anything that would be detected as anomalous against that API would have a high score, versus maybe like for my company, we ingest a massive amount of threat intelligence through APIs. Well, I really don't care what's going on with those APIs or if they're available or anything like that, because all they're doing is serving data to my organization.
Hmm.
So an attack against that, or if it's not available, the risk or the threat tolerance for that type of API would be very low. So it's really understanding what the APIs are doing, what are they providing access to know what is the level, what's our tolerance for the risk or the threat against this API, and then building those threat models. Hey, this is not normal activity for this API. Basically, kind of the point I was trying to make is like identify what is normal for your APIs, and then build your threat models based on what would be outside the scope of what's considered normal.
Oh, for sure. I love that. Yeah, and I think prioritizing and mitigation of threats is key. I love that OWASP has highlighted two specific methodologies regarding APIs. They call it DREAD, damage, producibility, exploitability, affected users, and discoverability. And then they have this other term called PASTA, which I love because it includes attack simulation and threat analysis. And to me, that's key because as you continue to monitor your network and trying to figure out what's going on with your APIs, being able to reduce the risk by APIs and building those mechanisms in place is key. Are there any types of signals specifically to APIs or detections in place that someone like you who manages a great threat intelligence company could, even though if you're doesn't matter your maturity level of a company, like you're supporting somebody who has very little knowledge of APIs to someone who's very mature, some things that can help them when actually building these types of monitoring mechanisms in place. So specifically is what types of signals are beneficial for them to actually find the bad stuff?
Yeah. Well, for like standard indicators to compromise, some things that organizations might want to take a look at is that there are a list of botnets out there, and there's not really any good reason any of these botnets should be touching your organization's infrastructure or calling out to your APIs.
Right.
So just saying, hey, botnets not allowed. As well as, I think a good question would be for a lot of organizations, is there any reason why the Tor network should be reaching out to your APIs? And, or can we just safely say Tor nodes, no, you can't talk to our APIs. Doing simple things like that would, I think, go a long way in protecting organizations against some of these threats.
Awesome. No, love that. My next question would be, and I'm looking at the comments to see if I'm missing any questions from the audience because I have tons. Is, with these types of known bad quantities, any types of botnets and so forth, what about tools? I know there's a plethora of tools that we now see in the environment, free actually on the internet, you can go and download. Is there any quick way to detect those types of tools, like Frida, for example? That are specific to APIs that we can now put as a detection into, whether it's any type of API SIM or any type of dashboard where, it's easy for an operations team, an engineering team, an analyst team to detect those bad adversaries trying to do something bad with the, and actually attack APIs in the environment.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a lot of API specific security platforms out there that are doing just that, bringing in threat intelligence, bringing in threat modeling into helping organizations protect their APIs. I would say though, one of the points I was trying to make is those platforms are great for security of the APIs. But you have, the broader picture of the entire organization where, the WAF might be out there and it might be protecting more than just the API. So having all that information, including the information from your APIs, perhaps in the SIM or the data lake, is a better place to be able to correlate that information and those threats and look across the entire enterprise rather than just your subset of what's going on in your APIs.
Awesome. No, love that. And I think also, I think you mentioned in so many words to like have a small list of things to do to get to that level of maturity, even a cheat sheet, right? Of, hey, this is the approach. This is what you want to do. This is how you want to document these things. Even understanding the data flows, because I think that's very important too, really understanding data flows through a system and to identify whether the system might be attacked or not, and understanding if there's other levels of defense protecting those APIs or not. What type of advice would you give to someone who's really understanding not so much the smash and grab threats, but the threats that are specifically more APT related? How do we, it's kind of like a very, I want to say loaded question, so to speak, because there's a lot of analysis and you're looking at things, in time. You may have to go back 3 months or 4 months, who knows, to really understand what's happening. It might be a low and slow attack. What are some suggestions that you can give to anyone in the audience on how to really understand what's happening in their environment if they were being attacked by an APT?
Right. So I guess that's one of the benefits now of the new data lake, data warehousing solutions, is that you are able to store a great amount of data, months, years of data that you can go back and look for those slow, persistent threats over time. But then just, I would say, looking over, what would be kind of the normal user behavior, because those slow, persistent threat actors will have to deviate from normal user behavior in order to gather the data that they want to, perhaps over time. So, just threat modeling of, okay, well, they're calling the data, and yes, it's occurred over a 3-month period, but they're accessing data that they really shouldn't be asking for, and they're asking for a big subset of data, perhaps, and it's not all at once, but, it's over a period of time, and that's not normal user behavior. And then, also, a little bit, the user usually authenticates from this location, but now they're authenticating from these other locations, and just, a little bit establishing what is normal activity between, your normal users, as well as, those anomalous users that maybe are gathering a subset of user data that they, nobody else is asking for that data. Why is this one person looking for this data? And just monitoring, not only, the security of your APIs, but what your APIs are doing, and the calls to the APIs, and what the customers are doing when they're calling your APIs, having access to that data so that you can, I know some of the tools allow you to do user behavior analytics on your APIs and the data that they're serving up to customers. So, I think those solutions are definitely out there right now, and definitely that's probably one of the ways of securing APIs in the future is, understanding what's normal for the users, so that we can identify the persistent threats.
No, love it. Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Shannon, this has been a phenomenal talk. Really enjoyed the conversation. You gave us some really great points on threat modeling. Love the presentation. Again, I just got it. It was super entertaining for me. Any closing thoughts for our audience that you want to kind of leave with them?
No. Well, threat correlation and threat intelligence and identifying threats against your APIs can kind of be a scary and daunting task if you're starting out from scratch. But you got to start somewhere. So start, like I said, by documenting what you have for APIs, and then you can go from there. And it can be as easy or as complicated as you want it to be.
Perfect. Thank you again, Shannon. We loved having you be part of Apisecure 2023. You have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.